The park bench was the same one her father used to bring her to every Sunday morning, back when she was 7, and the world still made sense. Victoria Sterling sat there now at 38, a 4-carat diamond heavy on her finger, watching a little girl chase pigeons, while her father called out warnings about running too fast. She didn't mean to start talking to him when he sat down on the other end of the bench, didn't plan to tell a complete stranger about the 15 men she'd turned down in 5 years, or the 16th proposal she'd finally accepted 3 weeks ago. But something about the way he listened, really listened, while his daughter climbed the oak tree nearby, made the words spill out like water through cracked glass. She told him about the billionaires and politicians, about saying yes this time, because 38 felt like a deadline, and being alone felt more terrifying than marrying a man whose touch left her cold. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer easy comfort or congratulations. He just looked at her with eyes that had seen grief up close and asked one quiet question that split her carefully constructed world in half. You want a husband? Or are you just looking for shelter? The question hung between them in the autumn air, and for the first time since she was 15 and found her father's body in the garage, the park, the Sunday mornings, everything good ending in a single afternoon, Victoria Sterling couldn't hide behind her corner office or her designer armor. She could only sit there, watching a stranger's daughter laugh in a tree, and wonder when she'd stopped knowing the difference between safety and surrender. Victoria had rules. 15 years of building Sterling Financial Consultants from a basement startup to a $40 million empire had taught her that control meant survival, and vulnerability meant weakness. The diamond on her left hand represented the perfect equation. Gerald Whitmore, 42, heir to a commercial real estate fortune, wanted a wife who looked good at charity galas and didn't ask uncomfortable questions about prenuptial agreements. She wanted security, a wedding that would satisfy her parents, and the comfort of knowing she'd never end up like her father, broken, bankrupt, hanging from a garage beam with a foreclosure notice still clutched in his hand. It was supposed to be simple. A business arrangement dressed in white lace and champagne toasts. Gerald's mother had already hired the wedding planner, reserved the plaza for June, ordered invitations with both family crests embossed in gold. Victoria had attended 3 dress fittings, smiled through engagement photos, and told herself the hollow feeling in her chest was just pre-wedding jitters. Everyone got cold feet. Everyone questioned their choices. The difference was that most people didn't spend their Tuesday afternoons sitting on park benches, confessing their doubts to strangers. The man's name was Marcus Reed, she learned after 20 minutes of talking. His daughter was Sophie, 7 years old with scraped knees and a laugh that reminded Victoria of wind chimes. Marcus had carpenter's hands, rough and capable, with sawdust still caught under his fingernails. He worked in a wood shop in Brooklyn, built custom furniture for people who cared more about craftsmanship than brand names. His wedding ring was gone, but the pale line on his finger said it hadn't been gone long. My wife died 3 years ago, Marcus said when Victoria asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that came after screaming. Car accident. She was on her way to pick up Sophie from kindergarten. He watched his daughter balance on a low tree branch, his whole body angled toward her like a shield. I said no to moving on for a long time. Said no to my sister's friend, to the woman at Sophie's school, to everyone who thought I needed fixing. Then one day Sophie asked me why I looked so sad all the time. And I realized I'd been saying no to the wrong thing. Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, some sealed chamber she'd welded shut at 15. What were you saying no to? Living, Marcus said simply. I thought keeping everything the same was how I honored her memory. But I was just hiding. Building walls and calling it loyalty. He turned to look at Victoria then, and his eyes were the color of slate after rain. That's what your question made me think of. You're not asking if you should marry this guy. You're asking if you're allowed to want something real." The diamond suddenly felt like it weighed 10 pounds. Victoria twisted it on her finger, watched it catch the afternoon light and throw rainbows across the concrete. "I don't know if I remember how to want things," she admitted. "I've spent so long protecting myself from needing anyone that I'm not sure there's anything left underneath the armor." Sophie dropped from the tree branch then, landed hard, and started crying. Marcus was on his feet before Victoria could blink, scooping his daughter up with practiced ease, checking her palms for splinters, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're okay, Bug. Just a little scared, that's all. Scared and hurt aren't the same thing." He met Victoria's eyes over Sophie's head. "Sometimes we forget that." Victoria left the park 40 minutes later with Marcus's business card in her pocket and a question lodged behind her ribs like a splinter. She drove to her penthouse apartment in Tribeca, poured a glass of wine she didn't drink, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city lights blink on one by one. Her phone buzzed with texts from Gerald's mother about floral arrangements, from her own mother about seating charts, from Gerald himself with a reminder about dinner on Friday with the Vanderbilt Foundation board. She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she pulled out the business card. Marcus Reed, Reed Woodworks, Brooklyn. A phone number in simple black ink. She traced the numbers with her finger and remembered the way he'd looked at his daughter, like she was the entire world contained in 70 pounds of scraped knees and wild laughter. When was the last time anyone had looked at Victoria like that? When was the last time she'd let them? The wedding was 8 weeks away. 8 weeks of dress fittings and tastings, and her mother's increasingly anxious phone calls about whether Victoria was really sure this time, really certain. Because backing out would be such an embarrassment to both families. 8 weeks of Gerald's cold efficiency, his morning emails outlining their schedule, his evening texts that never asked how she was, only where she'd be and when. 8 weeks of waking up with a diamond on her finger and ice in her veins. Victoria went back to the park the next Tuesday, told herself it was for the fresh air, the break from spreadsheets and contract negotiations, told herself it had nothing to do with the man who'd asked her a question she couldn't stop answering in her head. But Marcus was there, watching Sophie feed the ducks, and when he saw Victoria, he smiled like he'd been expecting her. "So," he said when she sat down, "did you figure it out?" "Figure what out? Husband or shelter?" Victoria opened her mouth to deflect, to retreat behind her carefully maintained walls, and found herself saying instead, "I think I've been looking for shelter for so long, I forgot what a husband was supposed to be." They talked for 2 hours that day, about her father, about the day she'd found him, about the way her mother had shut down after the funeral and never quite reopened, about how Victoria had built her company because money was the only thing that had ever kept her safe, the only thing that couldn't abandon her or fail her or leave her standing in a garage with the smell of death in her lungs. Marcus listened the way most people breathed, like it was natural, necessary, not something he had to perform. He told her about his wife, about the way she'd wanted 3 more kids and a house with a yard, about how he'd kept saying, later, when we're more settled, until there was no later left, about the guilt that sat in his chest like a stone, the way he'd thrown himself into being the perfect single father, because if he couldn't save his wife, at least he could save his daughter, about slowly learning that perfection was just another word for prison. "I'm not perfect anymore," Marcus said, watching Sophie try to teach a duck to eat from her hand. "Some days I burn dinner. Some days Sophie wears mismatched socks to school because I forgot to do laundry. Some days I cry in the shower where she can't hear me. But we're living. We're messy and broken and living." Victoria thought about Gerald's penthouse, where everything matched and nothing was ever out of place, where she'd be expected to quit her company after the wedding, to become Mrs. Gerald Whitmore instead of Victoria Sterling, CEO, where she'd have security and status and a marriage that felt like a mausoleum, beautiful, expensive, and full of things that used to be alive. "I think I'm making a mistake," she said quietly. Marcus didn't ask her to clarify. He just nodded. "What are you going to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? What was she going to do? Walk away from Gerald, from the wedding, from the safety net she'd spent 3 weeks convincing herself she needed? Disappoint her parents? Embarrass both families? Admit that she'd been so desperate to avoid being alone that she'd agreed to marry a man she didn't love? Or go through with it, wear the dress, say the vows, and spend the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she'd been brave enough to choose living over surviving? Victoria started going to the park every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes Saturday mornings, when Sophie didn't have school and Marcus brought her early to feed the ducks. Victoria never planned it, never marked it in her calendar, but somehow she always ended up there, sitting on that bench, talking to a man who saw through her in a way that should have been terrifying, but felt like oxygen. They were careful not to call it what it was, didn't use words like affair or cheating, because they never touched, never kissed, never crossed any line that Gerald's lawyers could point to in a prenuptial agreement. But Victoria knew betrayal when she felt it, knew that what was happening between her and Marcus was more intimate than anything she'd ever shared with the man whose ring she wore. You could betray someone with your heart long before you ever touched them with your hands. 6 weeks before the wedding, Gerald's mother, Catherine, showed up at Victoria's office unannounced. She swept past the receptionist like she owned the building, settled into the chair across from Victoria's desk without being invited, and laid a leather portfolio on the glass surface between them. "The prenuptial agreement," Catherine said in a voice that could freeze vodka. "My lawyers have made some additions. Standard protections, you understand. The Whitmore estate has been in our family for 4 generations. We simply can't afford any complications." Victoria opened the portfolio, read through page after page of clauses that essentially said she'd leave the marriage with exactly what she'd brought into it. Nothing of Gerald's, nothing of his family's, nothing but her own company and her own name. There was a morality clause, a fidelity clause, a clause that required her to resign from Sterling Financial within 6 months of the wedding. Another clause that gave Gerald sole discretion over where they'd live, how they'd spend holidays, whether she'd be allowed to work at all. "This isn't a prenuptial agreement," Victoria said slowly. "This is a contract of ownership." Catherine smiled, thin and sharp as a knife blade. "Call it what you like, dear. But if you want to marry my son, these are the terms. Non-negotiable." She stood, smoothed her Chanel suit, and paused at the door. "Oh, and Victoria? We know about the park, about the carpenter. I'd advise you to remember that reputation is everything in our circles. One doesn't throw away a future with the Whitmores for a man who works with his hands." After Catherine left, Victoria sat in her office until the sun went down and the cleaning crew came through. She thought about her father, about the foreclosure notice, about the way she'd built her entire life around never being powerless again. And she realized that somewhere along the way, she'd traded one kind of powerlessness for another. Her father had lost everything to debt. She was about to lose everything to safety. She drove to Brooklyn that night, found Marcus's woodshop through the business card address, knocked on the side door where light still glowed through the windows. He opened it in sawdust and surprise. Sophie already asleep upstairs in the apartment above the shop, and Victoria said the words she'd been carrying for 6 weeks. "I need to tell you something, but first I need to know. That question you asked me, about husband versus shelter, was that just philosophy? Or were you asking because—" She couldn't finish. The words stuck in her throat like glass. Marcus set down the chisel he'd been holding, stepped close enough that she could see the grain of sawdust in his hair, the tiredness around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened like he was bracing for impact. "I was asking," he said quietly, "because I'm falling in love with you, and I needed to know if I was falling alone." The world tilted, righted itself, tilted again. Victoria had spent 23 years protecting her heart, and here was this man in his workshop that smelled like cedar and sweat, offering her the exact thing she'd sworn she'd never want again, the thing that had destroyed her father, the thing she'd watched kill her mother from the inside out. "I'm engaged," she said, and hated how it sounded, like a defense, like an excuse. "I know. The wedding's in 6 weeks. I know that too. Gerald's family is powerful. His mother had me investigated. She knows about the park, about us talking. She'll destroy me if I walk away. She'll destroy you." Marcus smiled, sad and soft. "Victoria, I'm a widower with a 7-year-old daughter, working in a shop my dad left me when he died. I own one suit, and it's got a patch on the elbow. What exactly does she think she can take from me?" He reached out slowly, gave her time to pull back, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand was warm and rough and smelled like wood polish. "The question isn't what you'll lose. It's what you'll gain." Victoria thought about Gerald's cold efficiency, Catherine's leather portfolio, the life sentence disguised as a wedding. Then she thought about Tuesday mornings in the park, about Sophie's laughter, about the way Marcus listened like her words mattered, about living versus surviving, about the difference between a husband and shelter. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Good," Marcus said. "Being scared means you're doing something that matters." She kissed him then, in his sawdust workshop with the smell of cedar in her lungs, and it felt like jumping off a bridge, terrifying and exhilarating, and nothing like the cold performance of kissing Gerald, where she always felt like she was acting out a scene from someone else's life. This was messy and real, and tasted like coffee and fear. And when they broke apart, she was crying and laughing, and more alive than she'd been in 23 years. The engagement party was the following Saturday. 200 guests at the Whitmore estate in Connecticut, champagne and caviar, and a string quartet playing in the garden. Victoria wore the Dior dress Catherine had selected, smiled through introductions to Gerald's business partners and college friends, and felt like she was attending her own funeral. Gerald kept his hand on the small of her back all evening, proprietary and cold, steering her from conversation to conversation like she was a prize he'd won at auction. At 8 o'clock, Gerald's best man called for a toast. Speeches about how perfect they were together, how lucky Gerald was, how Victoria would make such an elegant addition to the Whitmore family. Catherine stood and talked about legacy, about tradition, about the importance of marrying within one's class. Gerald's father mentioned the prenuptial agreement like it was a dinner reservation, casual and expected. Then it was Victoria's turn. She stood with the champagne flute in her hand, 200 faces turned toward her in expectation, and felt the weight of the diamond pressing into her finger like a shackle. She thought about her father in the garage, about Marcus in his workshop, about the question that had split her world in half. "I need to tell you all something," Victoria said, and her voice came out steady despite the earthquake in her chest. 3 weeks ago, I said yes to Gerald's proposal. I said yes because I was 38, and alone, and terrified of ending up like my father, who killed himself when I was 15 because he lost everything and couldn't see a way forward. I said yes because safety seemed more important than happiness, because I thought marriage was about protection, not partnership. Gerald's hand on her arm, tight enough to bruise. Catherine's face going white with rage. Her mother's quiet. Victoria. No, from somewhere in the crowd. But she kept talking because if she stopped now, she'd never start again. Then someone asked me a question, A stranger in a park asked me, "Do you want a husband? Or are you just looking for shelter?" And I realized I'd spent 23 years confusing the two. I thought a marriage was supposed to keep you safe. I thought love was a weakness I couldn't afford. She looked at Gerald, at his perfect face and empty eyes. "I'm sorry, Gerald, but I can't marry you. Not because you're a bad person, but because marrying you would be like locking myself in a beautiful cage. And I've been in a cage long enough." She took off the ring, set it on the table next to her untouched champagne, walked through 200 silent guests and out the front door, and she didn't look back. Didn't look back when her mother called her name, when Catherine threatened lawsuits, when Gerald said, in a voice like ice, that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. She just kept walking until she reached her car, drove back to the city with tears streaming down her face and her hand shaking on the wheel, and somehow ended up at Marcus's workshop at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. He opened the door in his pajamas, took one look at her, and pulled her inside. Didn't ask questions, didn't say "I told you so." Just held her while she cried, and shook and laughed like someone who'd just jumped off a burning building and couldn't believe she'd survived the fall. Sophie came downstairs eventually, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and climbed into Victoria's lap without hesitation, her small, warm weight like an anchor to reality. "Did you do the scary thing?" Sophie asked. Victoria nodded, couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. "Good," Sophie said seriously. "Dad says the scary things are usually the right things. That's why they're scary." The fallout was immediate and brutal. Catherine Whitmore made good on her threats, spreading rumors through every social circle that Victoria was unstable, desperate, a gold digger who'd tried to trap Gerald and fled when confronted with the prenuptial agreement. Victoria's mother called twice and then stopped calling altogether, too embarrassed by the scandal to face her daughter. Half of Victoria's clients dropped her within a week, spooked by the gossip or pressured by the Whitmore family's connections. But the company didn't collapse. Victoria worked 18-hour days, rebuilt relationships one meeting at a time, and discovered that there were people who cared more about her financial expertise than her personal life. She sold her Tribeca penthouse, moved to a smaller apartment in Brooklyn, and learned to live on less than she'd spent on shoes the previous year. It was terrifying and humiliating, and the freest she'd ever felt. Marcus was careful not to rush things. They went on actual dates, cheap diners and free concerts in the park. Nothing that cost more than $20 because Victoria was rebuilding, and Marcus had never had money to throw around in the first place. Sophie came with them sometimes, teaching Victoria how to feed ducks without getting bitten, how to climb trees without fear. Slowly, carefully, Victoria learned what it felt like to be part of something real. 6 months after the engagement party, Victoria's father's old business partner reached out. He'd been following the news, he said. Wanted Victoria to know that her father would have been proud of her for walking away. That the foreclosure and bankruptcy hadn't been some moral failing, but the result of a predatory loan from a real estate investment firm that had targeted dozens of small business owners in the 90s. A firm called Wellington Properties, the parent company of the Whitmore estate holdings. Victoria sat with that information for 3 days. Then she did something she'd never done before. She hired a forensic accountant and started digging. Found loan documents with impossible terms, payment schedules designed to default, a pattern of acquisitions that followed bankruptcies the way vultures followed death. Found her father's name in a file of 30 other business owners who'd been systematically destroyed, so Wellington Properties could acquire their assets for cents on the dollar. The rage that filled her was clean and cold. She'd spent 23 years blaming her father for being weak, for giving up, for leaving her alone. And all that time, he'd been the victim of exactly the kind of predatory system Gerald's family had built their fortune on. The same family she'd almost joined, The same family that would have used her company the same way once Catherine decided Victoria had outlived her usefulness. She showed Marcus the documents on a Tuesday morning in the park, their bench, Sophie chasing pigeons while they talked. He read through everything in silence, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the pages hard enough to crumple them. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I don't know," Victoria admitted. "Part of me wants to burn their empire down, sue them, expose them, make sure everyone knows what the Whitmore legacy is really built on. But that won't bring your father back." "No, it won't." She watched Sophie trying to coax a pigeon onto her hand. "My father spent his last years consumed by what he'd lost. I don't want to spend mine consumed by revenge. Even if they deserve it." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife used to say that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. Maybe the way you honor your father isn't by destroying his enemies. Maybe it's by refusing to let them take any more of your life." Victoria thought about that, about the years she'd already given to fear, to protection, to building walls, about what she'd gained by tearing those walls down, about the difference between justice and vengeance, between holding people accountable and being held hostage by anger. She wrote one letter, sent it to the Attorney General's office with copies of every document she'd found, every predatory loan, every suspicious acquisition. Let the law handle Catherine and Gerald and their legacy of destruction. Then she deleted their numbers from her phone, blocked them on every platform, and made herself a promise. She would never again let the Whitmores occupy space in her head they hadn't earned through love. A year after the engagement party, Marcus asked Victoria to marry him, not with a 4-carat diamond, but with a wooden ring he'd carved himself from maple, smooth and warm and perfect. He asked her on their bench in the park, on a Sunday morning with Sophie as witness, and this time, when Victoria said yes, she knew exactly what she was saying yes to. Not shelter, not safety, not a contract or a merger or a beautiful cage. A husband, a partner, a life built on trust instead of fear, on love instead of protection. The kind of life her father would have wanted for her if he'd lived long enough to see her find it. They got married 6 months later in the park. 40 people on folding chairs, Sophie in a yellow dress carrying wildflowers instead of roses. No prenuptial agreement, no lawyers. No contract beyond the promise they made to each other in front of the people who mattered, to be messy and broken and living together, to choose each other, not because it was safe, but because it was real. Victoria's mother didn't come to the wedding, sent a card 2 weeks later with a short note. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to support your bravery. Maybe someday." Victoria put the card in a drawer and decided that maybe was enough for now. Some wounds healed slowly. Some never healed at all. But they didn't have to kill you if you didn't let them. On her first anniversary, Victoria stood in the park watching Marcus teach Sophie to ride a bike without training wheels. Sophie wobbled and shrieked and fell twice, and each time Marcus was there to help her up, to remind her that falling was part of learning, that scared and hurt weren't the same thing. Victoria thought about the girl she'd been at 15, standing in a garage with death in her lungs and terror in her bones. Thought about the woman she'd almost become, cold and controlled and slowly dying behind walls of her own making. She wasn't that girl anymore. Wasn't that woman either. She was someone new, someone who'd learned that the opposite of powerless wasn't powerful. It was open, vulnerable, brave enough to let people in even when letting them in meant they could hurt you. Brave enough to choose living over surviving, even when surviving felt safer. Sophie finally found her balance, pedaled 10 feet without falling, and screamed with joy loud enough to scatter every pigeon in the park. Marcus looked back at Victoria with a smile that felt like sunrise, and she smiled back, her heart full of the messy, terrifying, beautiful reality of being alive. She'd spent 23 years looking for shelter, but what she'd needed all along was this: Sunday mornings and scraped knees, and someone who saw her. Really saw her, and loved her anyway. Not despite her scars, but because of them. Not because she was perfect, but because she was real. The diamond had been beautiful, but this wooden ring, worn smooth by a year of dishes and work and living, was worth more than any stone could ever be, because it meant she'd finally learned the difference between a husband and shelter, and she'd chosen right.